We founded this network 8 years ago, and our goal, our vision is to really, since we're rather new to this discipline, this is a rather new discipline itself, our goal is to learn and share and shape together. And we also have expanded this network, even though many of us are involved in people experience, uh, to other disciplines. So UX, service design, CX people are more than welcome to be part of this. We feel that and hope that many of the problems and things that we're talking about are relevant and helpful to all of us. And you'll hear us use the term HX and EX a little bit interchangeably on this. We refer to it as HX, meaning the human experience of work, also emphasizing the fact that we're focusing on us as human beings and putting humans more back in the workplace. But we use this interchangeably with EX. So if you hear EX more later on, HX and EX are being used equally here. A couple of things we talked about last time, and I just want to talk a little bit more in depth to begin the session today. Since this is a new discipline, and we have some growing pains, some things that are common for any new discipline. But in this case, most of you, if you're involved in people experience or employee experience, you've started in the last 4 or 5 years. And most in this field have no prior training in human-centered design, in agile, or some of these other certifications. So we're a bit behind some of our colleagues who are in UX or CX disciplines who have had, in some cases, decades of experience. But this is a problem. This is an issue for many of us in terms of what we need to learn. And it's also impacting the maturity level. We've been measuring maturity for the last 7, 8 years since we're talking about maturity today in this field. We don't see a lot of progress in this, and this is main reason why we're talking about this topic today. If we look at the types of certifications or degrees on LinkedIn that people in these other disciplines of UX and service design or in analytics, you see some really well-defined and specific certifications or university degrees being mentioned on LinkedIn. And if I look at the people doing people experience or EX roles, fewer than 5% list any relevant skills. So we're also, I would say, facing a skills gap. And in many ways, this is, I would say, an existential challenge, because if we don't learn or treat this as a serious discipline and learn the skills, we're not able to really move forward and solve problems in a different way. So I use this Einstein quote: if we bring the same methods, the same tools to the problems that we're trying to solve, we're not going to get any place different. And in that sense, it is a threat, I would say, to our discipline, because we need to up our game. If we're going to help the business solve challenges, we need to have new ways of thinking, new kinds of tools to use this. And all of us are involved in doing this from an organizational setting. So that's why we're here today, is to talk about how we can move this forward. The team that I've chosen for this are people that I've known for at least 8 years. So all of these people here, I would say, with confidence, represent that upper tier of people who have both the tools and the knowledge and the methodology and the certification and training, but have successfully applied this in an organizational setting. So with that, I want to turn the time over to Julie.
Thank you, Elliot. That quote from Einstein is one of my very favorite ones. And I also want to take a chance here to thank everyone who joined us for our first meeting, where we looked at the first stage of the maturity model. We've already gotten some important key themes from the feedback you've provided. We're glad to hear that you find the model practical, that you see a business connection, that you see a need for stronger operational support for the model. We'll be working on that. And Elliot, toward the end of our time together, will describe some of the steps we're taking on that. You also shared with us that you loved that the model helps us to measure progress. There were some distinct needs, and I'll come to that in just a moment. In other words, practitioners have a different take on the model than do people who are in consulting firms or people who are in transition. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about what those differences are. I also appreciated, we all do, that you see some potential for this model, that there are interests in the tools and case studies and guidance that we can create for it. And again, envision some next steps that are very close to what we envision, an opportunity to tailor messaging and education and assets for each of the audience segments that we'll talk about in just a moment. Elliot, if you could just flip us to the next page. So as I mentioned, internal practitioners are especially valuing the practicality and clarity of the model and are looking for ways to engage key stakeholders and leaders in their organization. An important element of this is the strong proof of the efficacy of this model, and that's something that is especially relevant for people who are working to implement it in large organizations. Independent consultants are looking for use case studies, for model alignment with other models they may be using, and for ways to introduce this model to executives that they work with in their client organization. And then for people in transition, very practical needs. Let's talk about what this means for me. What are the skills I need to develop? How might it help me onboard in my next organization? And how do I develop a human-centered mindset? With that, I want to turn this over so we give the bulk of our time to Damon and Nina, who are going to be talking through the next phases of the maturity model. So take it away, Damon.
All right, thanks, Julie. Hey, everyone. For those of you that joined us last time, this graphic will look a little bit familiar. For those of you who are with us for just part two, this is the bulk of what we covered in the first session. And so this is the overview graphic that kind of at the 10,000 foot level describes the model. And so you can see across the top, we have three kind of maturity phases: learning, doing, and being. And then within those three phases, you can see the dimensions here in the middle. And the two that, stand out here in the center is that, as EX leaders and practitioners, we should always be doing our best to improve the experience of work in a tangible, measurable way. And also, and just as important, aligning those efforts to really drive outcomes with the business, again, in a tangible, measurable way. And then the four dimensions you see around the perimeter, these are the dimensions in which we've organized specific capabilities that you can build and mature over time. And then that's what we spell out here in the model. So with that, let's hop forward. And in part one, we kind of did a deep dive on teams that are really in this learning phase, because we feel like this is where most teams, most organizations are, kind of solidly in this space of just getting started or being early on this journey. And so what we're going to do today is share some context and some examples of how that matures in the doing and being phases for each of these dimensions. All right, well, with that, I will jump in. I'm going to cover the first three, and Nina will take the next three. But I'm going to start with a quick recap. So here we're on the impact of work, and this is the experience of work. So in part one, we talked about how, most teams early on the journey will identify early pilots and focus those pilots on driving small but tangible improvements for a specific set of employees. And then using human-centered design methods, especially things like user research and communications, that helps ensure that the employee voice is included and considered, all about their experience of work. And then socializing the experiential outcomes that you drive in these early pilots is instrumental to helping both your employees and your stakeholders understand and appreciate the value of this approach and your EX strategy at large. And so moving, into phase two here, the doing phase, as your EX practice matures, your teams will often expand beyond those initial pilots and they'll begin to identify and inventory key moments that matter throughout the employee life cycle. However, I think it's important that, just focusing on specific moments, and this can, usually take the form of like a program or a process or a policy that employees interact with. But focusing just on these specific moments can sometimes reinforce the traditional siloed HR thinking. And, when focusing on moments, it can likely often just include the single team or the single COE that's responsible for that specific moment. So in most cases, employees have broader needs and they're on a more complex journey leading up to and often after those moments. And so this is why, as EX teams mature, we tend to identify and focus on key employee journeys, sort of that end-to-end journey that employees are on to meet a need. And so here, leveraging, any employee insights or feedback you've collected allows you to focus your attention and prioritize on the most pressing employee journeys that align to tangible needs they have and have a high likelihood of reducing known employee friction. So really diving in and improving the experience of work for a broader set of employees is sort of this middle ground of maturity. And then in the being phase, in the most mature EX practices, robust and ongoing continuous listening capabilities are instrumented and automated. Employee feedback is captured in real time within key journeys, in addition to, some more traditional methods like engagement and pulse surveys, for example. Also really valuable here can be qualitative research methods like focus groups, interviews, and employee jam sessions. These can be very powerful ways to ensure that you're able to generate those high quality experience insights throughout the employee lifecycle. And then maintaining and actioning data from these feedback loops is really instrumental in continuously improving the experience of work. And, it's a really great way to bring employees, because they're our colleagues after all, but bring them along the journey with us, increasing transparency and really building trust. So, you know, I'll give a quick little example here to bring this to life. At multiple organizations, we've taken a look at reimagining the onboarding experience. This is where a lot of teams start. It's one of the first journeys that a lot of teams start with. And a lot of organizations will consider like onboarding that day one experience. But if you really think about it, the employee need there is to feel welcome and be ready to work. And if that's the end-to-end journey, that starts all the way back with offer and goes, a bit beyond the day one experience. Truly being ready to work takes a little more time than just day one. So if, we dive in, we, use service design to map that out. And what we find is what sort of the leaders had in mind was reimagining that day one experience. But when you map that into in journey, we often find 10, 15 different teams are involved across IT, HR, real estate, etc. And so bringing all those teams together, we were able to uncover tremendous opportunities to automate, personalize, and streamline and simplify that entire process. So it's a great way to remove a whole bunch of manual steps and reduce handoffs between all these various teams to really provide that simple, seamless end-to-end experience for new joiners. All right, so let's hop to the next one. So before I jump in, this is an important thought. So as EX teams, we can often jump in and improve any moment or journey or work experience. However, if it's not aligned to a tangible business outcome that's valued by your stakeholders, your efforts as an EX capability will be short-lived. So we always need to ensure that we're improving the experience of work, but while staying hyper focused on delivering tangible business outcomes for the organization. And so being a great EX leader or practitioner means ensuring that these two things always go hand in hand. So in the learning phase in part one, we talked about, even for those early pilots, it's important to align with your stakeholders on where to apply these efforts and where to prove and socialize the ROI of this new EX capability that you're building. And identifying and measuring the right experiential, operational, and outcome metrics will help ensure that you can socialize the impact, the business impact of your pilots. So as you mature here in the doing phase, you'll begin to look a little bit more broadly beyond the pilots for additional business needs that, like we said, align to the experience of work. And forming a cross-functional steerco can be a great way to ensure that you're collecting and prioritizing tangible business needs from senior leaders across your organization. And so often these steercos, will start with members from across your HRLT, heads of COEs, for example. But ideally, it would expand even further in scope to cover leaders in the other corporate functions like IT, comms, real estate, et cetera. Because these organizations also have a key role to play in delivering on the employee experience. And so building, an engaged steerco to help identify, prioritize, and target where to deliver EX projects that'll have a high ROI and ensure that they'll focus on tangible and measurable business outcomes is key. And then in the being phase, in the most mature EX practices, we're continuously validating and aligning to the evolving people strategy and also the evolving needs of the business. Your scope and your steerco at this stage can also increase even further to expand beyond the constraints of HR and the other corporate functions. And partnerships and EX projects conducted directly with business leaders. So again, breaking out of the corporate functions and getting closer to the business. This can also drive maximum impact by addressing business needs that are closer to the day-to-day way that work gets done. And so here, a quick example of business impact. There was some insights that were collected about an organization that I worked with that had, some pretty significant regretted attrition. We also saw a pattern with declining performance. There was our cost around recruitment were growing. And so we looked at some of those drivers underneath that were driving all that. And one of the key themes that surfaced through our qualitative research was that visibility into career opportunities was lacking, and that the existing, skills and learning paths weren't really aligned with career growth in a way that employees could really stitch those things together. And so, we did a whole assessment and a whole, build versus buy assessment. And what we ended up doing was building an entirely new digital platform that wove together skills, learning, and internal mobility. And then we also, updated policies and processes, leveraged some AI to personalize it and make it simple and intuitive to be able for employees to understand their current skills profile, the profile of career paths in front of them. And somebody will find that one and mute it. Develop new skills aligned to career goals they have, and streamline the movement of employees into these new roles across the organization. So, based on these business needs that we had, we were able to, really improve the employee experience as well, really driving impact in both dimensions. Okay, last one for me, touch here a little bit on leadership. And so in part one, we talked about how important, stakeholder alignment and support is one of the most important components to a successful EX program, especially in the early days. It's good to identify leaders and stakeholders that are eager to support the EX vision and mission. And they may not have a deep understanding of EX as a discipline at this point, but your pilots are a great opportunity to enable and activate them along the way. And so securing their sponsorship will be instrumental in socializing the value and the impact of your early EX efforts. And so here in the doing phase, as your practice matures here, your influence and your sponsorship will expand with your steerco and any other involved senior leaders that you've brought in along the way. And, as you work on this growing list of key employee journeys, the leaders and the stakeholders that you have involved in these projects, they'll begin to understand and also socialize the impact and the value of your efforts. And then gaining the support and the sponsorship of these leaders is key to really continue to build momentum and generate demand for this new capability you've developed from other leaders who, maybe in the early days were a little more skeptical of the approach. And then in the being phase, in the most mature EX practices, again, leaders from across your corporate functions and leaders from across the business start to understand the value and the approach of your EX strategy. These leaders are also using EX data and insights to make much more informed decisions and investments in both, experience and business outcomes that we talked about. And then lastly, these leaders really appreciate the EX strategy well enough to start to drive and be accountable for EX outcomes themselves and in their own teams and organizations. So they're asking the right questions, they're leveraging data and insights, and they're holding themselves and their teams accountable for their own EX practices and outcomes. And so here, just a quick anecdote about sponsorship and how important it was. At IBM, this mission was set off by our CHRO, Diane Gerson, at the time. And this was, many years ago. But one of the very first things that she did was to provide that sponsorship and air cover for, our new capability and this new strategy. And how she explained it to the organization over and over, which was very helpful, was, historically, we've been optimized for efficiency. But going forward, we're going to optimize ourselves and our organization, our HR organization around experience. And so just setting that intention and getting everyone on board was incredibly important. And then as an EX team and capability, we were able to follow that up. And so we brought all 140, HR leaders from around the globe together into a 2-day physical experience where we were able to enable them and activate them on a whole new way of HR way of working that blended, human-centered design, agile delivery, and product management. And just having the opportunity to do that with the leaders drove tremendous results across, the whole enterprise globally. So can't underestimate and can't sort of discount the value that engaging these leaders can have on your results. So with that, I'm gonna take a breath and I'm gonna hand it over to Nina, and she'll help go through the next 3 dimensions. Nina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Damon, and really very thorough explanation. I'm going to take the next 3 layers in the categories that really support having that impact on work and impact on the business, as Damon explained. The next one is related to capabilities. And what we see at the very earliest stage when companies are starting, and probably the majority of the companies are in this phase, as Damon explained, When you want to get it started, you probably are bringing in capabilities from outside, or you're trying to look to see if there is something within the company that can help you to really start with employee experience, right? So this is the very earliest stage. So you start identifying what are those capabilities, but most importantly, they will come from completely outside your organization or outside human resources, etc. When you are moving into the doing phase, we see a shift from outside to inside. So what we see is that more and more teams start developing their own internal capabilities so that they can focus and look at the employee experience and the journeys from different angles. And the type of capabilities that we are talking here about are really capabilities that probably are not the traditional ones that we know from human resources. So it's really understanding and developing internal capabilities on human-centered design, right? How to do journey mapping, how to prototype, different kind of things, but bringing in also those concepts of what it means to prioritize the journeys, what it means to really design the first prototypes, how do you test, how do you do research, etc. So what we see is that here's where the initial train the trainers programs probably are the first ones that start taking a life within the organization. And more within the field of human resources, these capabilities are being considered a fundamental for everyone else to get familiar with, to know, and also to bring in some external capabilities outside HR within those areas. And by that, I mean, you may need to bring data specialists, you need to bring researchers, you need to bring graphic designers, you name it. So it's building the capability more from within. What we see also is that we start fixing and detailing and creating a structured training program so that more and more people get familiar with it, understand how to do it in an experiential way for sure, but they start not only knowing what it means, but how to apply that knowledge. And last but not least, we see that there is an encouragement in terms of bringing all the capabilities together with the right tools for sure, as well in order to grow the understanding, but also the focus on how do you tackle your employee experience. So all of that, it gives a clear signal that the organization is already into this field, and this is something being taken seriously as well. When you go into more mature organizations that are on the bean phase, you see that actually this is more federated, that we are also expanding the knowledge into not only other regions, other locations, if you are part of the bigger corporate, but also sometimes even other functions that might be interested in adopting the same approach. And an example of that I personally have seen is the shift moving from we started on the innovation on the digital teams, it moved into human resources, it expanded into IT. So the adoption becomes bigger and bigger in the organization until you decide that this is the way of working, right? So equally, we see that senior leaders are trained, they understand what it means, they know how to work, and they know how to prioritize also the journeys that you want to really leverage using this approach. A good example of the transition being done, for example, has been, sorry, in ING when we got started in the doing phase in ING. Well, there was a group of people of externals coming, facilitating, doing the training, bringing people from different disciplines together, helping us to look at a journey from very different angle and different perspectives into building the internal capabilities. That's what for some of the people might be familiar with PACE. PACE was the ING way to innovate and to innovate across the board, the whole organization, using concepts of human-centered design, agile, product management, etc. And it took a life that is now fully embedded across the whole organization. And when I talk about capabilities, of course, it is the knowledge, the skills, the competencies, but it has all to do with having the right tools and methods that you need to have across the organization in order to make this happen and bring it to life. So this is the evolution in terms of capabilities. If we go to the next one, we are talking about the governance. Very good, thank you. We for some of you who were on part one, you may remember that we explained that when you are starting, usually we have a sponsor, a leader who is bringing the concepts of employee experience within the organization, who is also the biggest sponsor to start running a few pilots, right? We'll be mobilizing other business people, some key stakeholders, but pretty much owned by that person who is really on the driving seat to make or to embed this in the company. When you shift into the doing, you see, and Damon already mentioned as well, that we start making the shift into having an steerco. And a steerco is a group of people across the organization who really support actually the work that is being doing on employee experience, right? It will determine in terms of governance who owns and who has the responsibility of the work being done here. It still can be done in employee experience team. However, the decisions with regards to journeys, impact, investments that need to be done is predominantly now shifting into an steerco, right? And in that steerco, also Damon mentioned, you would have already people who are not necessarily part of the human resources COEs, but you will have also a business leader who's very much, impacted or wants to really make a big change in terms of experience within their own teams. And you will have people within IT, you will have people from communications, you name it. But the whole thing is actually making sure that the decision making is now moving from running a few pilots into the scope of a bigger dimension of your human experience projects and initiatives, right? The other thing that we notice here in the doing is that we tend to formalize more the channels in which we get insights in order to determine where the priorities should be. So that will lead you to set your listening strategy in the company, right? So it's not only about running an engagement survey once a year, but really finding all those touch points that will provide us additional insights to really understand what journeys should we be really focusing on first, where is the added value also of those journeys, and really start maturing into that direction. When we're going to the being, we see that the steerco or the human experience, the steerco employee experience expands across the whole organization. Now the organization will determine portfolios across different business units or across different journeys if you want to manage that well. But the accountability is spread also across the organization, overseen by this steerco still, in terms of where are we doing the funding, where are we allocating the resources, what are the journeys that are the most important ones. So you get a higher level of maturity already in this case. Examples that I have seen in terms of the doing in AkzoNobel, where I have been working on, well, we really determined some of the steercos that was in a standard practice, but for other type of projects, but anything that came on human experience, where we had to train actually the members of the steerco on how to look at things in a different way. For example, understanding what problems are you trying to solve with any project or any initiative, what would be the potential impact of that, etc. That was one of the things that was set up and was part also of the decision making also for budget allocation. On the bean, I would say ING probably is one of the front runners because they have a federated group of steercos in which everyone will be managing their own portfolio, and they're really making a step up in terms of okay, what is company-wide the focus that we need to have in human experience? Okay. The last category is the strategy, right? In the earliest stages, we see that the employee experience leader is socializing, is pretty much convincing, trying to convince everyone and finding some proof points of where those could be an example of a couple of journeys that will add value and will quickly show everyone else that this is a good way to go forward, right? But it's a lot of trial and error in this case. When it comes to a more mature phase, you see that the steerco will also determine pretty much those roles and responsibilities, but the strategy will now be looking not only at quick wins, but really looking at journeys end to end, right? And journeys being looked at end to end will give you a whole perspective, will give you a whole perspective about what is exactly the impact that we as an organization should be really looking at, because we know it's going to create a value, but also is going to increase the experience. So in other words, we are expanding the focus as part of the strategy, right? And this is also definitively looking not only at a moment that matter, but full journeys in the whole life cycle of the employees. So you move from small to the whole life cycle, understanding those journeys, and that's the progress that you're making. On the being side, when you are more mature, this is business as usual, and we see that employee experience becomes the core pillar of the people strategy, which is entirely aligned and connected to the business strategy. So they all go hand in hand. Business strategy definitely goes hand in hand with your people strategy. So it's not an isolated event as we saw at the beginning, but now it's going to be more cohesive, it's going to be more integrated, and a big pillar of your people strategy will have to do with human experience as well. Alignment with the business is more relevant, is stronger on the bean side, because as Damon already mentioned, metrics are clear. The value also is being clearly determined. So budget allocation, which is also something important in terms of your own strategy, your roadmap and your budget allocation are much more integrated with business decisions, not only with a specific people decisions. I hope this gives an idea of the transition that you have between the maturity when you are starting on the learning phase, moving into adopting and bringing it at the main and scaling up, until you have become an organization that is driven by employee experience. Next slide, please. So you may wonder, okay, but what do we do with all of this? Ourselves, we are working, and this is coming soon, is a work that we are doing as a team, and how to help really actually have an assessment that this is an illustration that we have here on the left side, an assessment that can guide organizations to see where are they in their employee experience, what level of maturity they have, which is extremely useful whenever you want to determine your roadmap. It has two benefits. It helps you to define your strategy, where are you going next, what is your roadmap, but at the same time, it empowers teams to take ownership by themselves. Where do they want to be? If they would be scoring very low, for example, in, I don't know, in the impact that you have, or on the strategy, on the governance, then what would be the logical next step for that team to move into the next quarter, for example? That could be something really empowering because the commitment is coming from the team. This is one of the possibilities that we see together within HXWise, and we are exploring and working towards that. Ideally, we want to share whenever someone is running an assessment with us, what are the strengths, what are the areas of improvement, but also provide a set of recommendations that will help them to move the needle into the right direction, wherever they want to be. Okay. On the next slide, we see potential applications for This, well, assessment is one that I just explained that will give insights in terms of where are we, where do we want to be, the road mapping as well that will determine your strategy. You could sell this to your own organization once you have an assessment and say, hey, in the next 3 years, we want to invest because we want to be here, from here to here. So what is that roadmap? And the coaching as well. You can get always a coach or build that internal capability that can help you actually to move from one to another level and increase the maturity. Change, of course, this is part of a transformation that you may bring into human resources, and definitely is one of the key elements that we see that may have an impact or might be very useful whenever you have a maturity assessment in order to really help get some real data so that it can help you to prioritize as well and drive the impact that you want to achieve. With this, I bring it back, I think is Elliot.
Need to unmute myself. Okay, so thank you, Damon and Nina, for taking us through that. And we do want to have some time at the end for questions, so I just want to wrap this up fairly quickly here. But to prepare this for launch, of course, we want to do some user testing and integrate the questions and feedback that we've been receiving so far, but also collect more specific information on the tool going forward. And we also want to share what we learn as we do this in articles, provide some online resources. And we as a team are working on a book that gives some use cases and examples of all of this. So our goal is to help organizations, those of you who are working as consultants or those of you who are freelancing, also be able to understand some tools or resources you have to see how does this progress forward and help organizations to become more mature in all of these phases. A couple places where you can pick up on some more information in the immediate future that we have planned. We have a series of webinars. Our next one is coming up on June 25th, where we'll have Birgit Mager. She's the founder of service design as a discipline. So this is a really unique way to engage with somebody who's a pioneer in one of the key areas. And we'll be talking more about service design. Service design actually came out of HR. So Birgit was working in Hewlett Packard in Germany, and her team came up with this idea of applying human-centered design into organizations and the systems and processes in which we work. So this is I think, a particularly interesting look at how this works. We're after a series of webinars and articles, etc. Later this year, we'll be doing a summit virtually, October 22nd and 23rd. Also, just to note here, you can connect here and I'll share these slides and the discount code, but Birgit has a global organization who have been doing this for 15 years. So their service design conference is going to be in Dallas this year, but also virtually, and you can apply a discount code for that. So like to stop there and do some Q&A. Invite you to scan this QR code so you can share your feedback with us on this webinar. But I would like to, and I'll leave this here for a few minutes so you can scan the QR and share the feedback, but to open this up for questions.
Hey, Elliot, I got a question via chat that I think brings up a great topic that's probably top of mind for everyone. So I'd love to throw this out there and see what some of the other leaders here think too. But the question was, in general, how could this be applied in sort of the place we find ourselves now in defining and organizing our thoughts around AI and the human experience of work. And so it has my brain kind of turning and generating ideas, and just a couple off the top of my head are, within any journey project, as you're using service design and mapping it and identifying those places where there's frictions or gaps or opportunities, part of the process and part of the mapping process, both in the current state and the future state, is to identify, places in the past it's been, where can we automate or where can we personalize? Those were early sort of AI capabilities. And so it's just an expansion of that thought, and at least in that case. So looking for those opportunities to apply AI in really meaningful and tangible ways that could streamline, simplify, or accelerate the employee performance or of those journeys, or the journey performance itself. I think that's one key way to think about this. Another is, when we apply this model, the ethics around AI often come up in the experience of work conversations. And so this also isn't a new concept, but it's growing in momentum and growing in scale. And so using, your EX strategy and your steerco and the governance decisions as an opportunity to get crisp as a leadership team on what is your point of view on the ethical use of data and AI and machine learning in your organization's, employee experience in the employee context, and most importantly, socializing that. So helping the organization understand how and when you plan to use these capabilities and apply them, but even more importantly, how you won't apply these technologies, and really socializing that point of view. I think that's another great way to apply this. There's probably a whole nother body of work around talent management and what's the impact of AI on your roles and job families and professions. That's probably a whole nother body of work that's kind of outside of this experiential stuff. But those are the things that come top of mind. I'm curious if anybody else has any additional thoughts.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think there's a very good point, Damon, what you are mentioning. I think this is a concern that a lot of people have, where I do see a trend, to your first point, is anything that may sound or even smell like HR operations. That's the very first target point to start automating using, we did a big chunk of that work ourselves within AkzoNobel, automating, streamlining those processes, simplifying, and making the experience and the interface, especially with employees, as simple, as lean as possible. And I would say sometimes we start thinking and dwelling a lot about where do we get started. I would say this is probably the easiest part to get really started. Definitively. Second, I do see, to the point of doing some research, I do see some trends in the market in which there are AI tools that can help you to capture insights on the go, real time. And those insights will be mapped automatically to a journey, so that you don't need to do the nitty-gritty detail of work. But let's say we're having this conversation here and there are some specific insights, those will be brought and captured automatically and brought into a specific journey. And when I go into the journey and I see changes, for example, in the experience, I can clearly see, oh, this is coming from the conversation that Nina was having with Damon in this current setting. So this is a great way of exploring the use of AI in order to continuously validate and keep feeding the insights you have on your journeys.
Yeah, Nina, something you mentioned brought up one last idea around the research. I think qualitative research with your employees, focus groups, interviews, that kind of work, can be incredibly insightful on finding and identifying the best places to apply AI and automation. Our employees that are doing the day-to-day work, they're closest to the work, they're closest to the outcomes. It's a great way to identify where are the places where AI could really make a difference in their performance and their work, and doing it with them, as opposed to, what we often see, a small little strategy team runs off and tries to develop this point of view in the corner. So I think that's another great way to really think about that.
Just to add from my side is, what I do see as a risk, as we're talking about employee experience being a horizontal discipline, AI is now being taken over, and the risk there you have is that it is a shiny tool that sits within the different verticals. And so I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that if we apply AI, we should always look at it horizontally, because we're really missing a chance where we can use data across the horizontal instead of using it vertically. And keeping the, let's say, the operating model of a business vertically oriented is not the way where I think we would like to go with the future.
I love that thought, and having an EX team join with the tech team to help make sure that those two things come together horizontally across the organization is, I think, fantastic advice.
Yeah.
One other challenge with AI too is that that if AI becomes the vehicle for describing or populating data for journeys instead of real research talking to real people, there's also the danger that we get an artificial or incorrect view, inaccurate view of both the description of the journey, but also key points of interaction, moments that matter, areas that need attention. So it's AI can be a very useful tool in helping us quickly set up an supposedly, so to speak, onboard a journey, get us started. But we need real people, real data insights to populate that. And also for interpreting and judging which pieces of information are the most critical to focus on immediately is something that still requires human beings. So AI can be a great tool for organizing and structuring that, but we still need people to judge which areas of focus we have. Other questions?
Hey, Elliot, this is Jason. I was the provocateur of that question to Damon. So I know this is for a longer conversation, but I'm now in a lot of conversations around how do we start to deconstruct work and figure out, what is the work that is explicitly human, what is the work that is explicitly AI, and what is the work that is explicitly human plus AI, which means then, right, how we approach human experience then becomes different because now we have to think about, I'll call it the technological or the platform element, and how does that relate to the employee experience? And then does ownership, and I know somebody put this in the chat, right? Does ownership change, right? Is it still the manager? Is it someone else? So it's a little bit complicated. I know it's, a simpler question to ask, but a more complicated and kind of thoughtful process to figure out how to adapt. I do think this is one of the key ways that we can do it. I think there's just some unknowns because we don't have a lot of strong examples outside of, software engineers using Copilot or, someone in customer service using, an AI bot as, first level and maybe second level of support to really be able to base this off of.
Yeah. No, I totally agree, Jason. And we don't know exactly, we're still beginning to understand exactly where AI is going to play a role. Where do you put those divisions, whether more of the work is being done by AI or people? Comments from the team?
Yeah, just one quick one that it's important to do everything we can to stay ahead of, the conversation because, we're already seeing across all of our organizations probably AI being used in lots of different ways. There's a million options for people to use, but if we're not defining, standardizing, and setting up a system where employees can use that securely and safely with your employee data, they'll start using tools, and many of them are already using tools outside of the organization, which can be a big, security risk and other things. So the more we can do to really help understand this, define it, and enable employees with the right AI tools is key.
I don't know personally what is the view in the US, but in Europe, we are known by regulating everything, right? So while we see other regions probably experimenting at a higher level than what we are doing here, in Europe, you could say there is a lot happening already. However, cybersecurity, data protection is probably one of the most important things that organizations are really looking into now. Definitely.